Late autumn 1943. The deep waters of the Möhne Reservoir are quietly rising against a massive, newly repaired concrete wall. Just months earlier, this indestructible structure was blown wide open in one of the most legendary aviation raids in history. 53 British airmen paid with their lives to shatter it, but today the gap is closed. Downstream, the factories of the Ruhr Valley steadily hum back to life, the devastating flood reduced to a temporary inconvenience. If a specialized squadron pulled off the impossible to break the heart of German industry, why was the enemy allowed to put it right back together? For decades, the story of Operation Chastise has been told as a singular triumph of British ingenuity and raw nerve. We remember the bouncing bomb. We remember the sheer courage of young men flying practically on the surface of the water. But that familiar heroic narrative masks a brutal strategic paradox. At its core, the Dambusters raid is the story of three distinct layers of war colliding. First, an engineer who solved an impossible physics problem. Second, a specialized squadron that executed an unthinkable mission with terrifying precision. And finally, a high command that possessed absolutely no plan for the day after. They didn't just break a concrete wall, they tore a gaping hole in the industrial heart of the Third Reich. Yet, leadership failed to turn that brief, chaotic window of vulnerability into a lasting, fatal crisis for the German war machine. This was not a failure in the skies over the Ruhr Valley. It was a failure of strategic vision. To truly understand how an unprecedented tactical masterpiece became an isolated, fleeting victory, we have to strip away the myth. We have to look at what happens when a military triumph is executed without a strategy to exploit it. And to grasp the sheer scale of the opportunity that was squandered, we first have to understand the absolute insanity of the mission these airmen were actually asked to fly. Forget everything you know about standard strategic bombing. The Avro Lancaster was a beast of an aircraft. It was a four-engine, heavy-lifting Leviathan, designed to fly at 20,000 feet, hidden in the safety of the dark, dropping tons of high explosives onto sprawling, city-sized targets below. It was not a nimble fighter. It was not a low-altitude attack plane. It handled with all the weight and inertia of the massive industrial machinery it was. Now, imagine taking that lumbering structure, powered by 4 roaring Merlin engines and weighing nearly 30 tons fully loaded, and dragging it down from the stratosphere until its belly is practically scraping the earth. The weapon they were carrying into the Ruhr Valley, codenamed Upkeep, was not a conventional bomb. It was a 4-ton, drum-shaped depth charge that had to be spun backward at 500 revolutions per minute by a belt-driven auxiliary motor long before the release point. The concept dictated that it be dropped on the water, skip violently over the protective anti-torpedo nets suspended in the reservoir, strike the concrete face of the dam, sink to a precise depth, and detonate. The hydrostatic pressure of the deep water would then act as a massive tamper, forcing the explosive energy directly into the concrete to shatter the wall. But physics is an unforgiving master. For this multi-ton steel cylinder to skip correctly, the delivery aircraft had to adhere to flight parameters that bordered on the absurd. The Lancaster had to be flying at exactly 232 miles per hour, not 230, not 235. Any deviation in speed, and the bomb would either hit the water with too much force and shatter its outer casing, or it would carry too much momentum and bounce harmlessly over the dam itself. The release point had to be calibrated to the split second, at an exact, predetermined distance from the dam's face, and the most terrifying parameter of all, the altitude had to be precisely 60 feet, just 18 meters above the surface of the water. 60 feet is roughly the height of a 5-story building. Flying at that altitude in broad daylight is hazardous even for a small, agile aircraft. Doing it in a 4-engine heavy bomber at night, over hostile, unfamiliar terrain riddled with steep valleys, power lines, and dense forests, is practically a death sentence. Standard barometric altimeters were utterly useless at this height. They lacked the rapid response and extreme precision required to keep a 30-ton aircraft from plunging into the reservoir. At night, the glassy black surface of the water perfectly reflects the sky, destroying any natural depth perception. If the pilot misjudged the height by just a few feet, the spinning bomb would either hit the surface at the wrong angle and disintegrate, or the plane itself would catch the crest of a wave, dig a wing into the water, and instantly tear apart. To solve the altitude problem, engineers devised a brilliantly simple yet terrifyingly dangerous solution. They mounted 2 Aldes spotlights on the underside of the bomber, one in the nose, one in the belly. They angled the beams so that they would intersect and form a figure 8 on the water's surface only when the aircraft was exactly at 60 feet. It was an elegant piece of applied geometry, but in practice it meant the navigator had to stare at the black water rushing by in the pitch dark, shouting instructions over the deafening roar of the engines to the pilot to adjust their height by inches. It also meant that during the final attack run, these unarmored bombers had to switch on bright lights in the middle of heavily defended enemy territory, essentially turning themselves into giant illuminated bullseyes for German anti-aircraft gunners waiting on the dam towers. And they still had to hit the exact release point. To do this, the bomb aimer used a crude but highly specialized wooden sight, waiting for the twin towers of the dam to align perfectly with 2 nails driven into the wood. The heavy bomber was no longer an area weapon. Standard bombing allowed for hundreds of yards of error. The physics of the upkeep mine forced the crew to operate this massive flying machine as if it were a precision sniper rifle, and they only had 1 bullet. There was absolutely zero margin for error in altitude, speed, or distance. Every single variable had to be perfectly synchronized in the span of a few terrifying seconds while flying straight and level into a concentrated funnel of tracer fire. This was the reality of the order given. The mission requirements deliberately defied basic aviation survival. It asked pilots to manually override every ingrained human instinct of self-preservation. When a glowing tracer shell flashes past your windshield, instinct screams at you to weave, to dive, to climb, to do anything to evade the incoming fire. These men were ordered to hold the control yoke completely steady. They were asked to perform a suicidal stunt with heavy machinery in the dark, knowing that the slightest twitch of a muscle, the slightest gust of wind, or a single enemy shell would mean instant destruction. Executing such a flawless mechanical run under immense psychological pressure required more than just raw courage. It required a level of flying proficiency that simply did not exist in standard bomber squadrons of the era. It demanded a highly specialized, hand-picked group of aviators capable of internalizing this extreme mechanical discipline and flawlessly following an impossible order without a second of hesitation. And against all laws of probability, the men who were gathered for this task did exactly what was asked of them. On the night of May 16, 1943, the theoretical physics and the suicidal aviation merged into a devastating reality. The specialized mines skipped across the black water, sank against the concrete faces, and detonated exactly as designed. The impossible happened. The massive masonry of the Möhne Dam fractured from the explosive shockwave, giving way with a deafening roar. Shortly after, the towering Eder Dam followed. A colossal wall of water, holding the combined weight of hundreds of millions of tons, tore through the narrow valleys. It wasn't just a flood, it was an inland tsunami, roaring through the darkness at terrifying speed. As the torrent surged downstream, it practically erased the surrounding landscape. Hydroelectric power stations, situated immediately below the dams, were instantly pulverized by the sheer kinetic force. Heavy railway bridges were snapped from their stone foundations like dry twigs. Paved roads, vital communication lines, and industrial sorting yards were swallowed by churning mud and heavy debris. The water supply, the literal industrial lifeblood of the German war machine, was suddenly, violently, bleeding out into the Ruhr Valley. The immediate shock within the German high command was profound. Authorities were entirely caught off guard by the sheer geographical scale of the destruction. This was not a standard bombing raid where fires could simply be extinguished and factory roofs quickly patched. The geography itself had been weaponized against them. Berlin scrambled to comprehend the disaster as officials realized the foundational resource of their industrial armaments center was rapidly vanishing, while simultaneously drowning the very infrastructure that relied upon it. To stabilize the sprawling chaos, the German emergency response had to be massive and instantaneous. They were forced to immediately mobilize around 7,000 workers, pulling heavy construction equipment and vital logistical resources away from critical military defense projects. Men, concrete, and heavy machinery urgently needed to fortify the Atlantic Wall against a looming Allied invasion were suddenly diverted to the muddy, destroyed valleys of the Ruhr, simply to build emergency water bypasses and restore the severed power grid. The tactical success of the raid was undeniable. The specialized aviators had delivered a catastrophic physical blow, proving that a small, highly trained force could successfully penetrate the Reich and annihilate its most heavily fortified structures. In the immediate, chaotic aftermath of that May night, as the floodwaters crested and the emergency alarms blared across the region, it looked like a definitive, war-altering victory. The physical dams were broken, the enemy was paralyzed in the mud. But beneath the surface of this spectacular tactical triumph, the operation concealed a fatal strategic flaw. The British High Command had successfully shattered the concrete, but the specific selection of their targets held a deep miscalculation, one they had not fully realized, and one that was about to turn a permanent crippling blow into a rapidly closing window of opportunity. To understand the true tragedy of the operation's aftermath, you have to look past the spectacular imagery of shattered concrete and examine the cold, unforgiving mathematics of industrial survival. The British High Command had correctly identified the Ruhr Valley as the mechanical heart of the Third Reich, but they fundamentally misunderstood how that heart actually pumped. We instinctively think of heavy industry as a beast fueled entirely by coal, fire, and iron. But the invisible, indispensable lifeblood of the entire German war machine was water. The region was a thirsty, interconnected circulatory system. To produce just one single ton of high-grade steel required nearly 30,000 gallons of water. It was needed in astronomical quantities to quench white-hot coke, to constantly cool the massive jackets of the blast furnaces, and to generate the high-pressure steam that drove the heavy forging hammers, shaping armor plating and artillery barrels. If the water pressure in the regional grid dropped below a critical threshold, the machinery wouldn't just slow down, it would cannibalize itself. If a blast furnace was allowed to cool because its water supply failed, the molten iron and slag inside would solidify into a massive, unbreakable plug. The furnace would be permanently ruined, requiring the entire structure to be dismantled brick by brick. The British intelligence services knew that severing the water supply was the key to paralyzing the Ruhr, but their selection of the specific targets contained a fatal geographical flaw. The primary target, the Möhne Dam, was indeed the jugular vein. It held back the vast majority of the water that fed the immediate industrial basin. Breaking it was a genuine strategic masterstroke. But the second target, the colossal Eder Dam, represented a profound failure of intelligence disguised as a tactical triumph. The Eder was the largest dam in Europe. It held back a staggering 200 million tons of water. When the men of the 617th Squadron successfully breached its concrete wall, the resulting flood was almost biblical in scale. A 30-foot-high wall of water roared through the valley at tremendous speed, entirely erasing small towns, sweeping away airfields, and severely damaging factories in the city of Kassel, nearly 35 miles downstream. It was a terrifying display of destructive power, and the aerial reconnaissance photographs of the drowned valley provided incredible material for British propaganda. But there was a glaring, undeniable problem. The Eder Dam was in the wrong valley. It did not feed the Ruhr River system. It regulated the Weser River, which flowed north toward Bremen. It was vital for maintaining inland shipping lane depths and agricultural irrigation, but it was completely disconnected from the steel mills of Essen, Dortmund, and the core Ruhr industrial web. The British had spent their most elite bomber crews, their limited supply of highly specialized weapons, and the lives of irreplaceable aviators to create a spectacular flood that merely inconvenienced the periphery of the German war machine. The destruction of the Eder generated terrifying headlines, but strategically, the industrial heart of the Reich barely felt its loss. The true prize, the linchpin that could have guaranteed the total collapse of the Ruhr alongside the Möhne, was the third target, the Sorpe Dam. And the survival of the Sorpe is where the British plan truly began to unravel. The Sorpe was fundamentally different from the Möhne and the Eder. It was not a gravity dam built of rigid masonry and concrete. It was a massive earth core dam. It was essentially a man-made mountain constructed of a central concrete core heavily wrapped in hundreds of thousands of tons of puddled clay, compacted soil, and crushed rock. The physics of the upkeep weapon, designed to skip across the water, sink against a flat vertical concrete face, and crack brittle masonry through hydrostatic shock, were utterly useless here. You cannot shatter a mountain of dirt. Furthermore, The geography of the Sorpe Valley was a nightmare for the pilots. The dam was nestled deep in a steep, narrow valley without a long expanse of water in front of it. A traditional perpendicular attack run was geographically impossible. Flying straight at the dam meant flying directly into a hillside. To attack the Sorpe, the heavy Lancasters had to fly along the valley, parallel to the crest of the dam. They had to fly over the ridge, drop violently into the dark valley, level out at a terrifyingly low altitude without the aid of their intersecting spotlights, and drop the massive 4-ton mine blindly into the water without spinning it. If they spun the weapon, it would simply bounce away from the dam's slope. They had to drop it inert, hoping it would sink and roll down the underwater earthen bank until it rested against the core. Despite the blinding fog, the lack of moonlight, and the impossible turning radius, several crews managed to execute this suicidal maneuver. The mines sank into the dark water of the Sorpe and detonated. Geysers of water and mud erupted hundreds of feet into the night sky. The shock waves blew massive craters into the protective layer of the dam, tearing away chunks of earth and exposing the concrete core. But the core held. Earth and clay do not shatter. They absorb kinetic energy and deform. The mountain absorbed the blow. And because the Sorpe Dam held, the Ruhr Valley retained a faint, desperate heartbeat. The destruction of the Möhne had severed the main artery, but the Sorpe remained intact as an emergency backup reservoir. The rigid limitations of the bouncing bomb, combined with the misallocation of resources to the Eder, had just barely saved German industry from outright paralysis. As the sun rose on the morning of May 17th, the mist and dust had not yet settled over the ruined valleys. In Berlin, the Minister of Armaments, Albert Speer, was violently awakened by frantic telephone calls from military command.
The reports were chaotic, fragmented, and bordering on the unbelievable. Speer immediately requisitioned an aircraft and flew directly to the Ruhr, landing at an airfield near Werl before driving straight toward the epicenter of the disaster. As his car navigated the treacherous, debris-choked roads, he witnessed the macabre aftermath of the flood. Derailed locomotives tossed into fields like toys, heavy steel bridges snapped from their stone foundations, and the bloated carcasses of livestock tangled in the ruins of submerged villages. But Speer was a ruthless technocrat. He ignored the flooded towns downstream. His focus was entirely on the source. When his vehicle finally reached the heights overlooking the Möhne, he stepped out and was struck by a profound, paralyzing shock. He was not looking at a flood. He was looking at an absence. The massive Möhne reservoir, which just yesterday had been a sprawling inland sea, was simply gone. In its place was a vast, scarred expanse of stinking mudflats, and a pathetic trickle of a river winding through the center. The hydroelectric power station that had stood at the base of the dam had been utterly erased by the falling water, leaving nothing but scoured bedrock. Through the massive, jagged 70-meter breach in the concrete wall, Speer stared at the terrifying reality of what the British had just achieved. The invincible Reich, protected by layers of radar, night fighters, and anti-aircraft batteries, had been surgically struck in its most secure, critical infrastructure by a handful of aircraft. The psychological blow was staggering. German concrete and German engineering had been defeated in a single night. But as Speer stood on the edge of the ruined dam, his mind raced past the immediate physical destruction. He wasn't looking at the drowned valley below. He was calculating the devastating drought that was about to hit the factories. He understood the interconnected math of the water grid better than the British intelligence officers who had planned the raid. With the Möhne empty and the Eder disconnected from the industrial system, the entire survival of the Ruhr now hung on the remaining water in the Sorpe and a few smaller secondary reservoirs. Speer rapidly ran the numbers. The summer was approaching. Even with the strictest rationing, forcibly redirecting water from civilian populations to keep the blast furnaces cooled and the coke ovens operating, the remaining reservoirs only held enough water to sustain the Ruhr's industry for a few weeks. If the autumn rains arrived late, or if the grid lost even a fraction more of its capacity, the factories would stop, the steel would solidify, the heart of the German war machine would go into cardiac arrest. Speer realized, with mounting dread, that the British hadn't just executed a raid. They had kicked open a strategic window that left the entire German armament industry
completely exposed to a fatal finishing blow. Panic dictated his next decisions. Speer knew exactly what he would do if he were sitting in the headquarters of RAF Bomber Command. He wouldn't wait. He would immediately exploit the chaos.
Speer rushed back to command headquarters and initiated an emergency mobilization on a scale rarely seen outside of a major frontline offensive. He bypassed standard military bureaucracy, directly ordering the organization TOT, the Reich's massive civil and military engineering group, to converge on the Möhne. He demanded that 7,000 construction workers, engineers, and thousands of forced laborers be immediately ripped away from highly critical defensive projects. Men, bulldozers, heavy cranes, and vital concrete supplies that were desperately needed to fortify the Atlantic Wall against the looming Allied invasion of Europe were suddenly loaded onto trains and diverted to the muddy, destroyed valleys of the Ruhr. Their orders were absolute. They had to plug the 70-meter gap in the Möhne Dam before the autumn rains began, or the reservoir would not refill in time to prevent an industrial collapse the following year.
Within days, the ruins of the Möhne transformed into a frantic, around-the-clock construction site. Because the hydroelectric station at the base of the dam was destroyed, the workers had to string up massive arrays of temporary floodlights, powered by mobile generators, to work through the night. They began dumping thousands of tons of earth, rubble, and hastily poured concrete into the breach, desperately trying to build a temporary earthen barrier behind the shattered masonry. But as Speer watched the repair efforts mobilize, a new, overriding terror took hold of him. The entire operation was a sitting duck. The German defenses in the region were in complete disarray.
The anti-aircraft gunners who had originally manned the towers on the dam were dead, swept away in the initial flood. The temporary repair site was situated in the middle of an open, easily navigable valley. At night, illuminated by the glaring glare of industrial floodlights, the thousands of concentrated workers, the heavy machinery, and the fragile, half-built earthen plug formed the most perfect, undefended bombing target in the entire European theatre. Speer knew that the British didn't even need to send the specialized 617th Squadron back with their complex spinning mines. A standard raid by regular Bomber Command Lancasters, flying at a safe altitude and dropping conventional high-explosive bombs, would effortlessly obliterate the repair crews, wipe out the heavy machinery, and completely wash away the temporary earthen dam. A single follow-up strike would guarantee that the Möhne reservoir would remain empty for the rest of the war.
Furthermore, if the British sent a small force to finish off the weakened Sorpe Dam while the defenses were down, the regional drought would become permanent. Every evening in late May and throughout the month of June, as the sun set over the Ruhr Valley, Speer and the local military commanders looked up at the darkening sky with a sense of absolute inevitability. They listened to the drone of the massive repair equipment echoing in the valley, knowing that the noise would mask the sound of approaching heavy bombers until it was too late. The German High Command was completely paralyzed by the anticipation of the killing blow. They had calculated the timeline. They knew the British intelligence planes were flying high overhead during the day, photographing the frantic repair work. The enemy knew exactly where the workers were. The enemy knew exactly how vulnerable the temporary dam was. It was basic, undeniable military logic. You blast open the fortress wall, and then you bomb the breach to slaughter the repairmen and keep the wound open. The entire German industrial hierarchy braced for the sirens. They prepared for the annihilation of the repair crews and the final, fatal collapse of the Ruhr's water supply. The door to a definitive, war-altering victory had been kicked wide open by 53 dead British airmen, and the entire German war machine was helplessly waiting for Bomber Command to walk through it. But the dreaded second strike never came. The skies over the Ruhr Valley remained empty because, back in London, a profound disconnect severed tactical reality from strategic vision. The architect of the British bombing campaign, Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, never truly believed in the dam raid. He viewed the specialized project as a frustrating distraction from his primary objective of leveling German cities, and once the raid ended, his focus immediately snapped back to his main campaign. Even if Bomber Command had possessed the foresight to recognize the gaping vulnerability Speer was desperately trying to plug, they simply lacked the tools to finish the job. The rotating upkeep mines were experimental prototypes, built in a frantic rush exclusively for this single night. There was no stockpile sitting in a warehouse. Every operational weapon had been spent or lost in the floodwaters. The delivery system itself was broken.
The 617th Squadron had executed the impossible, but they had been decimated.
Out of 19 Lancaster bombers that crossed the Channel, 8 were destroyed. 53 elite aviators were dead or missing. The specialized unit was in no shape to mount an immediate return. Command could not substitute them with regular bomber squadrons. A standard high-altitude night raid lacked the surgical precision to hit a 70-meter gap or a narrow earthen repair wall. Dropping conventional explosives from 20,000 feet would only scatter bombs blindly across the valley, risking heavy aircraft losses to night fighters without guaranteeing the destruction of the vulnerable repair site. This blindness was compounded by a massive intelligence failure. When reconnaissance planes returned with stunning photographs of the flooded Eder Valley, analysts in London were seduced by the sheer scale of the devastation.
They drastically overestimated the immediate industrial impact, failing entirely to anticipate how ruthlessly efficient the German emergency response would be. They could not fathom that Speer would rip thousands of workers away from coastal defenses to rebuild a dam in mere days. The clash was absolute, a breathtaking tactical opening on the ground, met with strategic paralysis in the air. While the British public devoured headlines, celebrating the surviving airmen as living legends, the men rebuilding the Möhne realized the truth. Looking up at a quiet sky, the German High Command knew they had been handed a miraculous second chance. Freed from the terror of a second attack, the German emergency mobilization shifted from a desperate gamble into a masterclass of brutal industrial efficiency. The organization taught did not just repair the Möhne Dam, they resurrected it at a terrifying pace. Under the glaring floodlights that Bomber Command ultimately ignored, military engineers and thousands of forced laborers worked in relentless, grueling shifts around the clock. They dragged away the shattered masonry, erected massive wooden forms in the riverbed, and poured new concrete by the thousands of tons. The gaping 70-meter wound in the wall shrank week by week. It was a frantic race against the calendar, driven by the absolute necessity of trapping the upcoming autumn rains before the industrial water reserves ran dry completely, and the Reich won that race. Before the year was out, the fresh concrete had set, the hydroelectric power stations were rebuilt and humming, the water began to steadily rise against the wall once more, and the blast furnaces of the Ruhr Valley kept firing. The critical window of vulnerability, the singular opportunity that had paralyzed the German High Command with fear just months earlier, silently and permanently closed. As the water refilled the reservoir, the true heavy cost of the raid settled into the mud of the valleys below. The torrent had claimed over 1,000 lives downstream, but the grim reality of that number was heavily weighted toward those who had no voice and no stake in the war. The victims swept away in the night were disproportionately foreign forced laborers, men and women from Eastern Europe, and prisoners of war. Locked in valley camps and factory barracks, they were completely unable to escape the freezing, churning floodwaters. Their deaths were a quiet, unredeemed tragedy, swallowed by the immense scale of the broader conflict. Back in England, the cost was measured in empty bunks and silent mess halls. 53 elite aviators were dead. These were some of the finest, most capable flyers of their generation, many of them barely in their early 20s. They had mastered an impossible physics problem, overridden every human instinct for survival, and flown heavy, unarmored bombers into a wall of tracer fire at 60 feet off the deck. They had paid the ultimate price to deliver a tactical masterpiece in the dark. They had done exactly what was asked of them. They had flown into the jaws of the enemy and kicked open a strategic door that could have crippled the Third Reich's war machine. But as the fresh German concrete dried in the Ruhr Valley, the bitter reality solidified with it. The young men of the 617th Squadron had sacrificed their lives to hold that door open, only to find that the highest levels of their own command had absolutely no intention of walking through it. As autumn returned to the Ruhr Valley, the deep waters of the Möhne Reservoir quietly rose against that new, massive concrete wall, exactly as they had before the raid. The cycle was complete. The breach was closed, the turbines spun, and the industrial heart of the Third Reich settled back into its rhythmic, mechanical pulse. Over the decades, Operation Chastise has been enshrined in history, celebrated for the bouncing bomb and the sheer, unyielding nerve of the young men who flew it. But this enduring, romanticized image of the shattered dam obscures the harsh strategic reality of what was actually achieved. The raid was not a failure. It was an undisputed, breathtaking tactical masterpiece. It inflicted real, immediate damage, forced Berlin to violently reallocate vital resources away from the Atlantic Wall, and proved definitively that hyper-specialized precision strikes could obliterate heavily fortified targets previously thought invincible. Yet the true tragedy of the Dambusters lies in the profound disconnect between the men who built the weapon, the men who flew it, and the commanders who ordered it. The engineer flawlessly solved a physics puzzle that the world deemed impossible. The crews of the 617th Squadron absorbed an unimaginable level of risk to execute that solution with terrifying precision. They did exactly what was asked of them, delivering a war-altering blow in the dark. But High Command treated the operation as a standalone spectacle, a mere propaganda victory, rather than the critical opening salvo of a sustained campaign against the German water grid. They demanded a miracle, received one, and then simply allowed the opportunity to wash away in the floodwaters. A mission executed perfectly in the sky was squandered in the briefing rooms of London. The gap in the concrete was plugged, and an unprecedented tactical triumph was reduced to nothing more than a temporary disruption.
Operation Chastise didn't fail in the skies above the Ruhr. It reached its tragic limit on the ground, where an exceptional tactical triumph was allowed to remain a single, unrepeated strike. Germany was given the time to rebuild exactly what 53 British airmen had given their lives to destroy.